So we just finished talking about the geosphere and the layers of the earth and the crust. We talked a little bit about mountain features and volcanoes and earthquakes and the things that shape our planet and how we live on it. So today we're going to we're gonna get our hands dirty with soil science, which soil science, the soil that we have at the different places is going to determine what plants can live there, and then the plants determine the animals, and it's all interconnected. Now, when my husband took soil science in college, the professor there had written his own lab manual, and the title of the lab manual is Dirt is a Four-Letter Word. He was really big into not calling it dirt, but to calling it soil, because soil is more than just dirt. There's a lot more going on. Soil plays a crucial role in the lives of plants and animals and the other organisms that live in an area. They're that link between the living and the non-living world. We have the dirt part, which is the particles, but then soil encompasses so much more than just the sand, the silt, the clay. It's also the bacteria and the fungi and the worms and all the nutrients that are being cycled through that layer of our earth. Now, we can classify soil in a couple ways. The first and predominant way that we're going to classify soil is based on its texture. We have different sizes of particles. There are the finest pieces of sediment that has weathered, which is clay-sized. Clay-sized has teeny tiny little particles, and when you feel clay, if it's dry, it feels almost like flour. If it is wet, then it feels really slick because those particles are really compact, really small. Silt is in the middle, and then sand is the coarsest. If you were to feel sand, of course, you would feel that gritty texture there. Those sand grains are too large to stick together, so sand tends to be a lot more fine and a lot drier than clay because it doesn't hold on to that water. The water just runs right through it. This is what's called a soil triangle, and this is going to be our activity for today. Whenever we finish our notes here, we're going to look at the soil triangle and how we classify soils based off of the percentage of sand, silt, and clay. And I'm going to show you how to read those and how to classify soils, because later we're going to do a soil lab where we're going to take your soil sample and decide what kind of classification it is. We can also classify soils based on their pH, whether it's acidic or alkaline. Here in East Texas, our soils tend to be acidic, mostly because of the pine trees that we have here. They drop their leaves, they're full of tannic acid. As that tannic acid breaks down in the soil, it releases that tannic acid into the soil, and it becomes very acidic. So things that grow best here are like our azaleas and our rose bushes, things that love that acidic soil. Other things that don't like acidic soil, that are sensitive to that, don't grow well here, no matter how good a gardener you are. You'd have to change the pH of the soil. In the Austin area, where you have more limestone, your soil tends to be more basic, and you get different plants growing in the Austin area than you get growing here, and it all has to do with that pH. pH does affect not only just what can grow there, but also how many nutrients it can support. If it's too acidic or if it's too basic, then the nitrogen and the phosphorus don't tend to be used very well by the plants, or they can even leach out of the soil completely and run off in the next rainstorm. There's also heavy elements like mercury and aluminum that can leach out of the soil and into the groundwater, which can harm the life around it. Soil comes from a breakdown of rock mixed with that organic matter that we talked about. Now, rocks can break down a number of ways. You can have physical mechanical weathering, which is wind and water. The rain falls, it seeps into it, and that breaks it down just into smaller chunks. It doesn't change the chemical properties of the rock. It just makes it smaller and smaller through time. Chemical weathering, however, things like rusting, will change the chemical composition of the soil. If you see the picture here, you notice how it's different colors there. The iron in that soil has rusted, with the water and the atmospheric gases to oxidize, and it's turned a completely different color. It's become a different substance. And then down at the bottom, we can even have biological weathering. Plants and animals, little worms burrowing through the soil, little moles that are digging, the plant roots here, they can grow and crack and break apart the rocks into smaller and smaller pieces. So even biological processes can be a part of the weathering process. Now, when you dig down into the ground, you'll run across several different layers, or what we call in soil science horizons. Now, these horizons start with the very top. That's the O horizon. You can see right here. O stands for organic. So the organic layer is where the stuff grows. You also don't just get growing things like plants, you can also get waste from organics, so decomposing organisms, earthworms crawling through. Anywhere you have that organic layer, that's the O horizon. Underneath that, you have the A horizon, which is what we call topsoil. If you've ever been familiar with farming, you'll know that good topsoil where you have the not only just the dirt, the weathered rock, but also the nutrients in it for your plants to grow. That's that good layer, that A area, that A horizon. E horizon is, E stands for eluviated. That means that the minerals inside have been leached out. There's no minerals left. They've all been taken up to that A horizon. B horizon, though, you get another layer of minerals because it's been brought down from the E horizon with rainwater. So you do get that movement of water that brings you down some minerals there in that subsoil. C horizon, you get larger pieces of rock, and then R horizon is that bedrock. Now in our area, you've got the B horizon, huge. And it takes a lot to get down to that R horizon. We don't tend to strike rock, except in certain places where you have outcrops exposed. Most of it is that subsoil and even the E horizon. But other places like West Texas, that O, A, E, and B, and C might be very, very tiny, and you get down to the rock very, very quickly. So it depends on how much weathering and erosion have happened in that area in the past as to the thickness of the layers. And you might even skip a layer completely, but for the most part, you should be able to recognize those layers as they go. In our soil, some soil properties also have to do with whether or not they can hold water, which is beneficial for plants, of course. Two terms here, porosity and permeability. Porosity is pore spaces. Is there space for the water to collect, or is there not? In the case of very clay-rich soil, those really tiny, fine particles take up a lot of space, and so you don't get a lot of pore spaces. In the case of sand, you have a lot of pore spaces. Those grains don't fit on each other just perfectly, and it leaves a lot of open space. But another thing also applies, permeability. You have to be able to get the water out of the soil. That's the ability of a liquid to flow. You may have big pore spaces, like in the case of limestone rock around Austin, but that limestone itself, even though the porous spaces are like cracks in the limestone, they might not be connected to where the water can flow out. So permeability is also key for being able to hold water and then move that water around and use it. In order to grow food, in order for it to be useful to people as well as to the native ecosystems, it has to be what we call arable. Arable is suitable for plant growth. And in order to be arable, it's got to be fertile. It has to have your nutrients that plants need, like nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus. And it also has to be what we call loamy. Now, loam, if you remember from our triangle a second ago, loam is right there in the middle where you have this good mix of sand, silt, and clay. The sand allows for pore spaces for the water to collect, but then the clay keeps it from running through too quickly. It kind of slows down the water as it runs through your sand and keeps it moist. So loamy, that big mix of sand, silt, and clay, is the perfect healthy soil for crops. However, it's not always perfect. We can have some problems with our soil, some naturally, and then some caused by farming practices. If we have plowed soil repeatedly over and over, it breaks down that soil and ends up creating what we call deadpan soil. It makes it very hard. The clay is left because the smaller particles that are not small, clay is the smallest, but the lighter particles like the sand has blown away. We can also cause problems with our soil from monoculture. Now, mono means single, and culture is what you've got growing there. So if you only plant one type of crop in a large area, then it decreases the genetic diversity and it pulls the same nutrients out year after year after year. So not only are those crops more susceptible to pests and diseases because you can run through one crop very quickly, but it also takes out all the nutrients that are important to that crop. So what we do instead is, now you'll notice as you drive past croplands west of here, is you might have strips like this is. You might have a strip of beans and then a strip of corn. And each season you might plant something different, maybe soybeans one year and corn the next year. And that rotation helps break up the nutrients that are being pulled out of the soil and also helps break up that monoculture so your diseases and your pests don't run through quite as fast. We learned this and we improved our practices through what's called the Green Revolution. And we'll talk again about this in greater detail when we talk about land use and agriculture. But real briefly, in the last 50 years or so, we have increased our agricultural production while decreasing the impact on the land. It's kind of an industrial revolution, except agricultural revolution. We now can use chemical pesticides, which are slowly being replaced by more biological pesticides, but these allow us to harvest more crops that are not damaged by pests like they used to be in the past. But then on the flip side, that's also kind of created some pesticide-resistant insects, and we'll talk again about resistance when we talk about ecology. There has been a lot more irrigation, and some of that has led to flooding our lands and salinization of the soil, waterlogging, overuse has led to land degradation. But the more we learn about our practices, the more we can improve with things like drip irrigation that bring the water source directly to the plants instead of just flooding the whole field, just using as much water as necessary. Soil erosion is still a problem everywhere. It's bare soil is very susceptible to erosion, but bare soil is where you plant your crops. So while you're planting, while they're growing, you have to mitigate and prevent that erosion. When soil is removed from one area and taken somewhere else, it's a problem, both for the area of land that lost the good fertile topsoil and also the bodies of water and the areas that have been covered up with all of this soil. Most of the really significant erosion that we noticed is this, what we call slash and burn agriculture, where they just remove everything off the surface, making a completely barren land and then plant on top of that. But again, there's ways to conserve that soil and prevent that problem. One way is to cover up the bare soil with animal waste or with leftover plant parts. This protects and covers the soil so it doesn't blow away as easily and returns those nutrients back to the soil. It's a win-win. We've gotten better at using non-chemical pesticides and fertilizers. We're starting to get into the point where that's cost efficient now, where it used to be not efficient enough to use large scale. We have understood ways of doing contour plowing. Contour is going with the lay of the land instead of cutting across it, and planting strips, maybe beans, corn, back and forth. And also using our natural friends, our trees and other plants to create wind barriers and reduce the force of the winds going across the crops. There's a couple of laws that I want you to know. One is the Soil Conservation Act of 1935, right following the Dust Bowl, created that Soil Conservation Service to work on improving farming practices so that we don't have a repeat of the Dust Bowl. And then here's a couple more that we'll stop with. 1977, we got our Soil and Water Conservation Act, which gives programs to aid landowners in conserving their soil and their water. And then 85, the Food Security Act prevents wetlands from being turned into farmland and provides incentives for that. So that's where we'll stop with soil and get ready for your soil triangle activity.